The call came in on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee and staring at unpaid bills scattered across my kitchen table. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet, and I almost didn't answer it. Work had been scarce lately, and most calls these days were from creditors or telemarketers. "Marcus Chen," I said, wedging the phone between my shoulder and ear. "Chen, this is Captain Rodriguez with Maritime Research Division. We need a dive team for an emergency recovery operation." I straightened up. Rodriguez had a reputation for running tight operations, and his calls usually meant decent money. "What kind of recovery?" "Cargo ship went down about 6 months ago, 120 feet down off the coast. Emergency beacon just started transmitting last week. We need experienced divers to investigate and retrieve the beacon." Something about that didn't sit right with me. Emergency beacons were designed to activate immediately when they hit water, not months later. The electronics should have been fried by saltwater corrosion long before now. 6 months underwater and the beacon just started working? I asked. "That's what we need to find out. Can you be at the harbor in 2 hours? We're paying standard emergency rates." Emergency rates meant triple pay. I looked at the stack of overdue notices on my table and made my decision. "I'll be there. Who's my partner?" "Steve Morrison. You two worked together before, right?" I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Steve was solid underwater, maybe the best diving partner I'd ever had. We'd done dozens of salvage operations together over the past 3 years. "Yeah, we're good. What's the ship's name?" "Meridian Star. Cargo vessel out of Seattle. Lost in a storm back in April." I grabbed a pen and scribbled down the details. "Any idea what kind of cargo?" "Mixed freight. Nothing hazardous on the manifest. Just get down there and find that beacon." After hanging up, I packed my gear methodically. Wetsuit, mask, fins, regulator, buoyancy control device. I checked each piece twice, testing seals and connections. The uneasiness from the phone call lingered as I loaded everything into my truck. The harbor was busy when I arrived, fishing boats heading out for the day and pleasure craft returning from early morning trips. I spotted the research vessel immediately. A 60-foot converted fishing boat with Maritime Research painted on the hull in faded blue letters. Steve's beat-up Honda was already parked nearby. I found him on deck, organizing his diving gear with the same careful attention he always showed. Steve was one of those guys who looked like he'd been born for the water, tall and lean with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of diving experience. "Marcus!" He looked up with a grin. "Ready for another adventure?" "Hey, Steve." I set my gear bag down and shook his hand. "What do you know about this beacon situation?" His eyes lit up with the enthusiasm he always got before interesting dives. "Isn't it fascinating? A beacon that's been silent for 6 months suddenly comes to life. There could be all kinds of explanations. Maybe the ship shifted on the bottom, or water levels changed enough to reactivate the electronics." I wasn't convinced. Electronics don't usually survive that long underwater, especially in salt water. That's what makes it so intriguing. Steve pulled his wetsuit from his bag and held it up to check for tears. "Think about what we might find down there. The wreck could be perfectly preserved, or maybe something happened to trigger the beacon. Either way, it's going to be an incredible dive." Captain Rodriguez appeared from the wheelhouse, a stocky man with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades at sea. He wore a crisp white uniform with captain's insignia, and his dark eyes had the sharp focus of someone used to command. "Chen, Morrison, good to see you both." He shook our hands with a firm grip. "Let's get you briefed." We followed him into the boat's small cabin, where nautical charts covered a table bolted to the floor. Rodriguez pointed to a spot marked with red ink about 15 miles offshore. Meridian Star went down here during a spring storm. She's sitting upright on a sandy bottom, 123 feet down. Visibility should be decent today, maybe 40 to 50 feet. I studied the chart, noting the depth contours and underwater topography. Any other wrecks in the area? Nothing significant. This is a clean dive site, no obstructions or hazards beyond the usual wreck diving concerns. Rodriguez traced the ship's outline with his finger. The beacon signal is coming from somewhere inside the hull. We need you to locate it and determine why it activated after all this time. Steve leaned over the chart, practically vibrating with excitement. How big is the ship? 300 feet long, standard cargo configuration. She's got multiple holds and deck structures, so there's plenty to explore. But remember, this is a recovery mission, not a pleasure dive. I nodded, though Steve's enthusiasm was starting to worry me. He got like this sometimes before big dives, almost too eager to get underwater. Usually it worked out fine, but something about this whole situation felt off. Any reports of other diving teams investigating the wreck? I asked. Rodriguez shook his head. You're the first. The beacon signal only started transmitting 4 days ago. Coast Guard picked it up during a routine monitoring sweep. We spent the next hour going over dive procedures and safety protocols. The plan was straightforward: descend together, locate the beacon source, assess the wreck's condition, and surface with whatever information we could gather. Standard salvage operation, except for the mystery of why the beacon had suddenly come to life. As we suited up on deck, Steve kept talking about the dive with an excitement that seemed excessive even for him. This could be the find of a lifetime, Marcus. A perfectly preserved wreck with an active emergency beacon. Think about the stories that ship could tell. I pulled on my wetsuit and checked my regulator one more time. Let's just focus on finding the beacon and getting back up safely. Of course, safety first. But his grin suggested he was already thinking about exploring every inch of the wreck. The boat's engines rumbled to life, and we headed out into open water. The morning was clear with light swells, perfect diving conditions. I should have felt confident about the operation, but the nagging uneasiness wouldn't go away. Steve sat across from me on the deck, adjusting his mask and fins with practiced movements. You know what I think? I think we're going to find something down there that nobody expects. Something that explains why that beacon waited 6 months to start calling for help. I watched him check his dive computer and wondered if his excitement was masking the same uneasiness I felt. Emergency beacons didn't just decide to start working after months underwater. There had to be a reason, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The research vessel cut through the swells toward the dive site, carrying us toward whatever was waiting on the ocean floor below. The descent felt like falling through liquid darkness. My depth gauge read 115 feet when the massive shadow of the Meridian Star finally emerged from the murky water below us. Steve swam beside me, his movements smooth and confident as we approached the wreck. The cargo ship sat upright on the sandy bottom, just like Captain Rodriguez had described. But seeing it in person was different. The thing was enormous, stretching out in both directions until it disappeared into the gloom. The hull was dark with rust and marine growth, but the overall structure looked surprisingly intact for something that had been down here 6 months. Steve pointed toward the port side where a jagged hole gaped in the ship's hull, probably 20 feet wide and twice as tall. The metal edges were twisted outward like something had exploded from inside, though Rodriguez had said the ship went down in a storm. I followed Steve as he swam toward the opening, our diving lights cutting pale beams through the water. The emergency beacon detector on my belt was picking up a steady signal, stronger now that we were close to the wreck. The little screen showed the source was somewhere deep inside the ship, probably in the lower decks or engine room. I tapped Steve's shoulder and showed him the display. He nodded and gave me the OK sign. then swam through the hole in the hull. I followed him into the ship's interior and immediately felt like I'd entered a different world. The water inside was clearer than I'd expected, and my lights revealed a main corridor that stretched ahead into darkness. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, most of them still intact. A few loose cables drifted in the current, but overall the ship looked remarkably well preserved. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. After 6 months underwater, I would have expected more damage, more debris floating around. Marine growth should have been covering everything by now, but the walls and ceiling looked almost clean. A thin layer of silt covered the floor, but not the thick accumulation I'd seen on other wrecks. Steve was already swimming ahead, following the main corridor deeper into the ship. His movements were purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. I checked my air supply, still plenty left, and followed him, keeping one eye on the beacon detector. The corridor branched off in several directions, leading to what looked like crew quarters, storage areas, and other compartments. Steve chose the main passage that ran toward the ship's center, where the signal was strongest. Our lights revealed doorways on both sides, most of them still sealed with heavy watertight doors. I caught up to Steve and tapped his arm, pointing to one of the side passages. We should be systematic about this, check each area methodically. But he shook his head and kept swimming forward, focused on something I couldn't see yet. The further we went into the ship, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't anything specific I could point to, just a feeling that something was wrong. The water felt different here, heavier somehow, and the silence was absolute except for the sound of our breathing apparatus and the occasional creak of metal settling. Steve paused at an intersection where the main corridor split into 3 directions. He checked his own equipment, then looked at me and pointed toward the left passage. The beacon signal was definitely coming from that direction, growing stronger as we approached. I followed him down the left corridor, which was narrower than the main passage. The walls here were lined with what looked like crew quarters, small rooms with bunks and personal storage. Most of the doors were closed, but a few hung open, revealing dark interiors that our lights couldn't fully penetrate. Steve stopped at one of the open doorways and peered inside. I swam up beside him and looked into what appeared to be a sleeping area with 4 bunks arranged along the walls. The room was empty except for some personal items floating near the ceiling. A few books, some clothing, a coffee mug. But something about the scene bothered me. The items looked too fresh, too clean. After 6 months underwater, paper should have disintegrated completely. The clothing should have been covered in marine growth or torn apart by currents. Instead, everything looked like it had been underwater for maybe a few days at most. I grabbed Steve's attention and pointed at the floating objects, trying to communicate my concern. He looked where I was pointing, nodded briefly, then turned and continued down the corridor. His response felt dismissive, like he wasn't really seeing what I was seeing. The beacon detector was beeping more frequently now, indicating we were getting close to the source. Steve led us deeper into the ship, past more crew quarters and what looked like a mess hall or common area. The preservation of everything continued to amaze and disturb me. Tables and chairs were still upright. Dishes sat on shelves as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment. We reached another intersection, and Steve paused to check his bearings. The corridor ahead led toward what I assumed was the engine room or cargo holds. The beacon signal was definitely coming from that direction, but something made me reluctant to go further. I checked my air supply again. Still good, but we'd been down for almost 20 minutes already. We needed to start thinking about our ascent time, especially if we were going to explore much more of the ship. I tapped Steve's shoulder and showed him my gauge, but he barely glanced at it before swimming forward again. His behavior was starting to worry me. Steve was normally very careful about always checking air supplies and monitoring bottom time, but today he seemed almost obsessed with following the beacon signal, ignoring standard safety procedures. The corridor we were following now was darker than the others, with fewer functioning lights on our equipment seeming to penetrate the gloom. The walls were lined with heavy machinery and pipes, suggesting we were getting close to the ship's mechanical areas. Steve stopped suddenly and held up his hand. I swam up beside him and saw what had caught his attention. A faint glow coming from somewhere ahead of us. It was too dim and diffuse to be artificial lighting, but it definitely wasn't natural either. The beacon detector was going crazy now, beeping almost continuously. We had to be within 50 feet of the source. Steve looked at me and pointed toward the glow, his eyes bright with excitement behind his diving mask. I nodded, but my uneasiness was growing stronger. Something about this whole dive felt wrong. The too perfect preservation of the ship, Steve's strange behavior, and now this mysterious glow coming from deep inside a wreck that should have been completely dark. But we'd come this far, and we had a job to do. I followed Steve toward the source of the light, my hand instinctively moving to check that my diving knife was still secured to my belt. The corridor ahead curved slightly to the right, and as we rounded the bend, the glow became brighter and more defined. What we found waiting for us in that deeper part of the ship would change everything I thought I knew about this dive, about Steve, and about what was really happening down here in the darkness of the ocean floor. I swam into what looked like the crew sleeping quarters, following the narrow corridor that branched off from where Steve had continued down the main hallway. The space opened up into a rectangular room with 4 metal bunks bolted to the walls, 2 on each side. Personal belongings floated in the water, a paperback book with pages that fluttered like dying fish, a coffee mug that bobbed near the ceiling, work shirts that drifted like ghosts. The preservation was wrong. Everything looked too fresh, too clean for a ship that had been underwater for 6 months. The metal bunks showed no rust. The fabric wasn't rotted or covered in marine growth. It was like the ocean had forgotten this room existed. That's when I saw the body. It floated near the bottom bunk on the left side, face down in the water. A man in work clothes, blue coveralls and a flannel shirt that still held its color. I swam closer, my fins barely moving as I tried to stay quiet, though I didn't know why. The emergency beacon detector on my belt continued its steady beeping, but softer now, like it was holding its breath. I reached out and gently turned the body over. The face that looked back at me was perfectly preserved. No bloating, no decomposition, no signs that sea creatures had been feeding. The skin was pale but intact, the features clear and defined. A middle-aged guy with a graying beard and crow's feet around his eyes. He looked like he'd just drowned yesterday, not 6 months ago when the Meridian star went down. But it was the eyes that made my blood freeze. They were wide open, staring directly at me with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. Brown eyes that seemed focused, aware, like he was seeing me floating there in front of him. I told myself it was just the water pressure, just the way bodies looked underwater. But those eyes tracked my movement as I shifted position. I tried to back away, pushing against the water with my hands, but something grabbed my left arm. The dead man's fingers wrapped around my forearm, with a grip that was impossibly strong. Cold flesh pressed against my wetsuit, and I could feel the pressure even through the neoprene. His eyes never blinked, never looked away from my face, and his mouth opened slightly, like he was trying to speak. I yanked my arm back, kicking hard with both fins to break free. The grip held for a moment that felt like hours, then suddenly released. I shot backward through the water, my regulator hissing as I breathed, too fast, too shallow. The body floated there motionless again, arms drifting at its sides like nothing had happened. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the corpse. It looked normal now, just a dead body floating in a flooded room. But I could still feel where those fingers had grabbed me, could still see those brown eyes watching my every move. I had to find Steve. I had to tell him what I'd seen, what had just happened. This wasn't a normal wreck recovery. This was something else entirely. I swam backward out of the crew quarters, keeping my eyes on the body until I reached the corridor. Then I turned and kicked hard toward the main hallway where Steve had gone, following the path deeper into the ship. The beacon detector's beeping grew stronger as I moved, leading me toward whatever was waiting in the Meridian Star's dark interior. The corridor stretched ahead of me, lined with pipes and conduits that should have been corroded, but looked like they'd been installed yesterday. I could see light ahead, not the pale glow from our diving lights, but something else. Something that pulsed, like a heartbeat. I found Steve near what looked like the ship's galley, examining a row of metal cabinets that hung open in the current. He was moving methodically from one to the next, his light playing over dishes and utensils that floated in perfect suspension. When he heard me approaching, he turned and gave me a thumbs up through his mask, like everything was perfectly normal. I swam up beside him and grabbed his shoulder, pointing back toward the crew quarters. I made the hand signals for problem and danger. But Steve just looked at me with that same calm expression he'd worn since we entered the wreck. He shook his head and pointed deeper into the ship, toward where the beacon signal was strongest. I tried again, more urgently this time, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the way we'd come. But Steve pulled free and continued his methodical search of the galley, like I hadn't said anything at all. Like the dead man who'd grabbed me was just another piece of floating debris. The beacon detector on my belt was beeping faster now, almost continuously. Whatever was calling to us from the depths of the Meridian Star was close, and Steve seemed determined to find it no matter what I'd discovered in the crew quarters. I caught up with Steve near the galley's far end, where he was methodically examining a row of storage lockers. My fins kicked up small clouds of sediment as I approached, and I grabbed his shoulder to get his attention. When he turned, I pointed urgently back toward the crew quarters, then made the hand signal for problem, a closed fist tapped against my palm. Steve's eyes met mine through his mask, but his expression remained oddly calm. He gave me a brief nod, the kind you'd give someone mentioning the weather, then turned back to the lockers. I grabbed his arm and pulled, trying to get him to follow me back to where I'd found the body. He allowed himself to be led for a few strokes, then gently but firmly pulled free and continued his systematic search. The beacon detector on my belt kept up its steady rhythm as I led him through the corridors. We passed the intersection where I'd first split off from him, then down the narrow passage to the crew quarters. The rectangular room looked exactly as I'd left it. 4 metal bunks, floating personal items, and there in the corner, the body. The dead man still floated near the bottom left bunk, his blue coveralls and flannel shirt moving gently in the water's current. His graying beard drifted around his face, and those brown eyes remained wide open, staring. I pointed directly at the corpse, then looked at Steve to gauge his reaction. Steve swam past me into the room, his movements casual and unhurried. He glided right by the floating body, close enough that his fins should have disturbed it, and began examining the bunks themselves. He ran his gloved hands along the metal frames, checking the welds and joints like he was conducting a structural inspection. I swam closer and pointed again, this time positioning myself so Steve would have to look directly at the corpse to see me. The dead man's eyes seemed to track my movement, just as they had before. I tapped my diving knife against my tank to get Steve's attention, then pointed emphatically at the body floating less than 3 feet from where Steve hovered. Steve glanced in my direction, followed my pointing finger, then looked back at me with a slight shake of his head. Not the kind of head shake that meant, "I don't see anything unusual," more like, "Stop wasting time on irrelevant details." He gestured toward the corridor, indicating we should continue deeper into the ship. I grabbed the dead man's arm and lifted it, trying to make the body more obvious. The flesh felt cold and rubbery through my gloves, but solid, definitely real. I waved the corpse's hand at Steve, who was now examining the personal belongings floating near the bunks. He picked up the paperback book, flipped through its waterlogged pages, then let it drift away. The dead man's arm fell back to his side when I released it. Growing frustrated, I swam directly between Steve and the body, blocking his view of everything else in the room. I pointed at the corpse, then at my own eyes, then back at the corpse. The universal signal for, "Look at this." Steve's response was to swim around me and continue his inspection of the room's fixtures. We left the crew quarters with Steve leading the way back toward the main corridor. I followed, constantly looking over my shoulder at the body floating in the room behind us. The dead man's eyes remained fixed in our direction until we rounded the corner and lost sight of him. The beacon signal grew stronger as we moved deeper into the ship. Steve navigated the corridors with purpose now, no longer stopping to examine every detail. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, following some internal compass that aligned perfectly with the beacon signal. We passed through what looked like a mess hall, long metal tables bolted to the floor, bench seating, a serving counter with heat lamps still hanging overhead. Everything appeared far too clean and well preserved for a ship that had been underwater for 6 months. I spotted movement in my peripheral vision and turned to investigate. Another body floated near the serving counter. A woman in a white cook's uniform, her hair tied back in a net that somehow remained perfectly positioned. Her skin had the same pale, waxy appearance as the man in the crew quarters, and her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I grabbed Steve's arm and pointed, but he was already swimming toward the mess hall's exit. I tried a different approach. Instead of pointing, I swam directly to the body and positioned myself next to it, wrapping my arm around the corpse's shoulders like we were posing for a photograph. The dead woman's head lolled against my shoulder, her open eyes now staring at Steve. Surely he couldn't ignore this. Steve glanced in our direction, gave another one of those dismissive nods, and continued toward the corridor. I released the body and swam after him, my breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. The regulator felt tight in my mouth, and I had to consciously slow my air consumption. We entered a new section of the ship, what appeared to be crew recreation area. Pool table in the center, chairs arranged around small tables, a television mounted on the wall, and more bodies. 3 of them this time, scattered around the room like they'd been playing cards when the ship went down. All perfectly preserved, all with those same wide-open, aware-looking eyes. I swam to each body in turn, waving my hands in front of their faces, lifting their arms, even gently shaking one by the shoulders. Steve methodically examined the room's fixtures, checking the pool table's felt, opening and closing cabinet doors, testing the stability of the mounted television. He moved through the space like the bodies simply weren't there. The 4th body I found was in a narrow maintenance corridor that branched off from the recreation area. A man in coveralls similar to the first corpse, but younger, with dark hair and a mustache. He floated upright against the wall, arms at his sides, looking like he was standing at attention. When I approached, his eyes definitely tracked my movement, following me as I swam from left to right, then back again. I reached out and touched his face, and the skin felt real, cold and slightly rubbery, but unmistakably human flesh. The eyes blinked, once, slowly, like someone trying to clear their vision. I jerked my hand back and kicked backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Steve appeared in the corridor entrance behind me.
I pointed frantically at the standing corpse, then swam over and grabbed Steve's mask, forcing him to look directly at the body. Steve's eyes focused on the spot where the corpse floated, and for a moment, I thought he finally saw it. Then he gently removed my hands from his mask and shook his head again, not in confusion, but in what looked like mild annoyance.
We continued deeper into the ship, and I kept finding them. Bodies in sleeping quarters, bodies in storage rooms, bodies floating in corridors. I counted 12 total, though there might have been more in areas we didn't explore. All in the same impossible state of preservation, all with those wide, staring eyes that seemed to follow my movements. Each time I tried to show Steve, his reaction was the same. A brief glance, a dismissive nod, then back to whatever task had captured his attention. He moved through the ship like he was following a predetermined route, checking specific locations in a specific order. The beacon detector's beeping had become almost continuous now, indicating we were very close to the signal source. Steve's behavior had changed in other ways too. He no longer responded to my hand signals about air supply or dive time. When I tapped my pressure gauge and showed him the reading, he looked right through me. His movements had become more mechanical, less like the fluid, practiced motions of an experienced diver, and more like someone going through predetermined motions. We reached what appeared to be the ship's engine room, a vast space filled with massive machinery, pipes, and electrical panels. The beacon signal was strongest here, the detector on my belt beeping in rapid, urgent pulses. Steve swam directly toward a control panel on the far wall, moving with the same purposeful determination he'd shown throughout our exploration. I followed, but kept looking back at the corridor we'd just left. In the dim light from our diving lamps, I could see shapes moving in the darkness behind us. The bodies we'd passed were no longer stationary. They were following us, swimming with the same mechanical precision that Steve now displayed. Their eyes remained fixed on me as they approached, and I realized with growing horror that Steve couldn't see them because he was becoming one of them. I followed Steve deeper into the ship's bowels, my beacon detector screaming in rapid-fire pulses that meant we were practically on top of the signal source. The corridor narrowed here, forcing us to swim single file through a maze of pipes and electrical conduits that looked like they'd been installed yesterday instead of corroding underwater for 6 months. Steve moved with that same mechanical precision I'd noticed before, his fins cutting through the water in perfect rhythm. No wasted motion, no hesitation at intersections, like he knew exactly where he was going. When I tapped my pressure gauge against my tank to get his attention, he didn't even turn around. We'd been down for 35 minutes now, well past the point where any responsible diver would start thinking about ascent time. The beacon detector on my belt had gone from beeping to one continuous electronic shriek. Whatever was broadcasting that emergency signal, we were right on top of it. Steve suddenly stopped at a heavy watertight door marked "Engine Room, Authorized Personnel Only," in faded red letters. The wheel lock had been turned, leaving the door slightly ajar. Steve grabbed the wheel and spun it counterclockwise with both hands. The door swung open on hinges that moved too smoothly for something that should have been seized with salt corrosion. Beyond the threshold, a faint green glow pulsed like a heartbeat. I grabbed Steve's shoulder and shook it hard enough that his regulator shifted in his mouth. When he turned to look at me, I pointed emphatically toward the way we'd come, then drew my finger across my throat. The universal signal for "cut it out." "We're leaving." Steve's eyes met mine through his mask, and for a second I thought I saw recognition there. Then his expression went completely blank again, like someone had flipped a switch. He shook off my grip and swam through the engine room doorway. I followed him into a cathedral-sized space filled with massive diesel engines, their metal surfaces gleaming like they'd been polished that morning. Pipes ran along the ceiling in perfect parallel lines, and electrical panels lined the walls with their gauges and switches arranged in neat rows. Everything looked brand new, which was impossible after 6 months underwater. The green glow was coming from a control panel on the far wall, where banks of monitors displayed scrolling data in symbols I didn't recognize. Not English, not any language I'd ever seen. The screens pulsed in sync with my beacon detectors shrieking, and I realized the emergency signal wasn't coming from some piece of standard maritime equipment. It was coming from whatever was running those displays. Steve swam directly toward the glowing panel, like he was being pulled by an invisible rope. I tried to follow, but something made me look back toward the engine room entrance. The bodies were there. All 12 of them, floating in the doorway like they were waiting for permission to enter. The cook in her white uniform, the maintenance worker with the mustache, the card players from the recreation room, every corpse I'd found throughout the ship. They hung motionless in the water, their wide eyes fixed on me with that same aware stare I'd been seeing all along. But now they weren't just staring, they were smiling. I spun back toward Steve, who had reached the control panel and was running his gloved hands over the surface like he was reading Braille. The screens responded to his touch, cycling through different displays of those alien symbols. Each time he pressed something, the green glow intensified, and my beacon detector's shriek climbed higher in pitch. I swam toward him, my diving knife already in my hand, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. Steve wasn't Steve anymore. I could see that now. The way he moved, the blank expression, the complete disregard for basic diving safety. Whatever had happened to the crew of this ship was happening to him too. When I looked back again, the bodies had moved closer. They were swimming now, their movements synchronized like a school of fish. The cook's hairnet floated perfectly in place around her head. The maintenance worker's mustache swayed gently in the current. They all kept smiling those impossible smiles as they glided through the water toward us. I reached Steve just as he pressed both palms against the largest screen. The entire panel erupted in brilliant green light that turned the water around us into liquid emerald. The beacon detector on my belt went silent, its job apparently complete. Steve turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes had changed. They were still blue, still recognizably his, but they held the same vacant awareness I'd seen in all the corpses. He reached out toward me with both hands, his movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, knife raised, but there was nowhere to go. The bodies had formed a semicircle behind me, blocking any escape route back to the corridor. They floated there patiently, their smiles never wavering, their eyes never blinking. Steve took another stroke toward me, his hands outstretched like he wanted to embrace me, or drag me down to join whatever collection this was. The green light from the control panel painted everything in sickly underwater shadows, and I realized that the emergency beacon had never been a distress call. It had been bait. I had to get out of there. Whatever was happening to Steve, whatever had taken control of him down in that engine room, I couldn't help him anymore. The green light from those alien screens had done something to him, just like it had done to all those bodies floating throughout the ship. I turned toward the corridor that would lead me back to the hull breach, back to open water and safety. But Steve moved faster than I expected, his body cutting through the water with that same mechanical precision I'd been watching for the past few minutes. He positioned himself directly between me and the exit, arms spread wide like he was herding me back toward the glowing control panel. "Steve, get out of my way," I tried to say through my regulator, but the words came out as useless bubbles. I gestured frantically toward the corridor, pointing at my pressure gauge, tapping my watch. We'd been down here too long. Way too long. Steve's eyes met mine through his mask, and for just a second I thought I saw recognition there. The real Steve, the guy who'd been excited about this dive, who'd talked about finds of a lifetime on the boat ride out. But then that blank expression settled back over his features, and he reached for me with both hands. I tried to swim around him, but he grabbed my buoyancy control device with his left hand and my weight belt with his right. His grip was iron strong, stronger than any human grip should be underwater. He started pulling me back toward the control panel, back toward that sickly green glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. No. I fought against his hold, kicking with my fins, trying to break free. But Steve's strength was impossible. He dragged me through the water like I weighed nothing, his movements deliberate and unstoppable. Behind us, I could hear the 12 corpses moving closer, their bodies cutting through the water in perfect synchronization. I reached for my diving knife, the 6-inch blade I'd checked and rechecked before every dive for the past 8 years. My fingers found the handle strapped to my right leg, and I pulled it free from its sheath. The steel caught the green light from the control panel, throwing wavering reflections across the engine room walls. "I'm sorry, Steve," I thought, and drove the blade into his chest. The knife went in clean, right between his ribs where it should have punctured his lung and heart. Steve's body went rigid for a moment, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull back a few inches. His eyes widened behind his mask, and I thought I saw the real Steve surface again, confused and terrified. Then his body went completely limp. His arms dropped to his sides, his head tilted back, and he started to sink toward the engine room floor. I watched him fall, my heart hammering against my ribs, the knife still clutched in my trembling hand. For maybe 3 seconds, I thought it was over. I thought I'd killed whatever had taken control of my diving partner, and now I could get the hell out of this nightmare ship. Then Steve's eyes snapped open. He straightened in the water like someone had pulled his strings taut. The knife was still buried in his chest, the handle protruding from his wetsuit, but there was no blood, no red cloud spreading through the water around the wound. Nothing. Steve looked down at the knife, then back at me. His expression was curious, almost puzzled, like he was trying to figure out what this metal object was doing, sticking out of his body. He reached up with both hands, grasped the handle, and pulled the blade free with a wet, sucking sound that I felt in my bones. The wound in his wetsuit sealed itself. Not healed. Sealed. Like the neoprene was reforming, erasing any evidence that I'd stabbed him at all. Steve held my knife up between us, examining the blade in the green light. Then he let it go, and it tumbled toward the engine room floor in lazy spirals. "What the fuck are you?" I tried to scream, but only bubbles came out. Steve reached for me again, his movements patient and methodical. I kicked backward, my fins churning the water, but he followed with that same mechanical swimming style. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Like he had all the time in the world. I pulled out my backup knife, a smaller blade I kept strapped to my left arm. This time I didn't aim for his chest. I went for his throat, driving the point toward the soft spot just below his mask strap. The blade went in clean. Steve's head snapped back, and dark fluid leaked from the wound. Not blood, but something thicker and darker that didn't disperse in the water like blood should. It hung around the wound in oily tendrils. Steve's hands went to his throat, and for a moment he thrashed in the water like he was choking. I thought maybe I'd found something vital, something that could actually stop him. Then he straightened again. The dark fluid stopped leaking. The wound closed. Steve pulled my second knife free and let it fall. He looked at me with those blank, patient eyes, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't hurt him. Whatever he was now, whatever had taken control of his body, it was beyond anything my knives could damage. I drew my emergency knife, the third and smallest blade I carried. Steve didn't even try to avoid it this time. He just floated there while I stabbed him in the shoulder, the stomach, the thigh, Each wound sealed itself within seconds. Each blade fell uselessly toward the engine room floor. The 12 corpses had moved closer during my futile attack. They formed a loose circle around us now, all of them wearing those impossible smiles, all of them watching with wide, unblinking eyes. The cook in her white uniform, the maintenance worker with his perfect mustache, the card players from the recreation room, all of them floating with the same mechanical precision that Steve now displayed. I was out of knives, out of weapons, out of options. Steve reached for me one more time, and this time I didn't fight him. What was the point? I couldn't hurt him, couldn't stop him, couldn't reason with him. He was gone, replaced by something that wore his face and used his body but wasn't human anymore. His hands closed around my arms, and he started pulling me toward the control panel again, toward that pulsing green light that had transformed him and all the others. I could feel the alien energy washing over me, could feel it trying to get inside my head, trying to rewrite whatever made me human. But something in me rebelled against it, some core part of my mind that refused to be overwritten. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was just dumb luck. But whatever it was, it gave me one last burst of desperate strength. I twisted in Steve's grip, planted both feet against his chest, and kicked off as hard as I could. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and his hands slipped from my arms. I shot backward through the water, past the circle of smiling corpses, toward the engine room exit. The bodies turned to follow me, but they moved with that same deliberate precision that had replaced Steve's natural swimming style. They were fast, but not fast enough to catch someone swimming for his life. I reached the corridor and kicked hard with my fins, propelling myself through the narrow passage between pipes and conduits. Behind me, I could hear them following. 13 bodies moving through the water in perfect synchronization, their movements creating a rhythmic swishing sound that echoed off the corridor walls. I swam harder than I'd ever swum in my life, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming for oxygen. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, but finally I saw the intersection ahead, where it opened into the main hallway. From there, it was a straight shot to the mess hall, then the crew quarters, then the hull breach and open water. I burst into the main corridor and turned left, swimming toward the ship's exit with everything I had left. My pressure gauge showed I was running dangerously low on air, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of this ship, get to the surface, get away from whatever had taken control of Steve and the others. The hull breach appeared ahead of me like a window into salvation. Sunlight filtered down through the water beyond the twisted metal edges, and I could see the sandy bottom of the ocean floor 40 feet below. I'd never seen anything more beautiful in my life. I shot through the opening like a torpedo, my tank scraping against the jagged metal. The open ocean embraced me, clean and bright and free of that sickly green glow. I looked back at the ship one last time and saw 13 figures floating in the hull breach, watching me go. They didn't follow me into open water. They just hung there in the darkness, patient and still, like they were waiting for something. I turned toward the surface and started swimming up as fast as my lungs would allow, breaking every rule of safe diving I'd ever learned. Rapid ascent could cause decompression sickness, could put nitrogen bubbles in my bloodstream, could kill me just as surely as whatever was down in that ship. But I didn't care about the risks anymore. I just needed to get as far away from the Meridian Star as possible, needed to reach the surface and the research boat and people who were still human. The water grew brighter as I climbed toward the sun, and I kicked harder with each stroke, racing toward the light. I kicked hard toward the surface, my lungs burning as I fought against the water pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed that I was ascending too fast, that the nitrogen in my blood would bubble and cripple me. But I couldn't slow down. Not with those things still down there in the wreck. The water grew brighter as I rose, shifting from the deep green of the engine room to pale blue, then finally to the golden shimmer of sunlight filtering down from above. My pressure gauge needle sat firmly in the red zone. Maybe 5 minutes of air left, if I was lucky. I'd been down there for over 40 minutes, way past safe limits. I broke the surface with a gasp that turned into a cough, salt water burning my throat. The research boat floated about 50 yards away, its white hull gleaming in the afternoon sun. I could see figures moving on deck, Captain Rodriguez and Technician Walsh, probably wondering where the hell Steve and I had been. I inflated my buoyancy vest and started swimming toward the boat, each stroke sending sharp pains through my chest. Decompression sickness maybe, or just the aftershock of what I'd seen down there. My hands shook as I grabbed the dive ladder hanging off the stern. "Chen!" Captain Rodriguez's voice carried across the water. "Where's Morrison?" I couldn't answer yet. My legs felt like rubber as I climbed the ladder, tank clanking against the rungs. Walsh appeared at the rail and grabbed my gear, helping haul me over the side. I collapsed onto the deck, water streaming from my wetsuit. "Jesus, Marcus, you look like hell," Walsh said, kneeling beside me. His red hair was damp with sweat, glasses fogged from the humidity. "Where's your partner?" I pulled off my mask and regulator, gasping. "Steve's. He's still down there." Rodriguez stepped closer, his weathered face creased with concern. "What do you mean, still down there? Equipment malfunction?" "No." I struggled to sit up, my head spinning. Something happened to him. Something's wrong with that wreck. Walsh started helping me out of my gear, unclipping the weight belt and sliding the tank straps off my shoulders. "Take it easy. You've been down for 43 minutes at depth. Might be some nitrogen narcosis affecting your thinking." "I'm not narked," I snapped, though even as I said it, I wondered if that could explain what I'd seen. There were bodies down there, 12 of them, maybe more, all perfectly preserved like they'd just drowned yesterday. Rodriguez and Walsh exchanged a look. The captain crouched down next to me, his dark eyes studying my face. "Bodies. Chen, that ship's been down for 6 months. Any crew would have been recovered or—" "These weren't crew," I interrupted. "I mean, they were, but they were wrong. They followed us. And Steve, he couldn't see them. Then something happened to him at the control panel, and he tried to—" I stopped, realizing how insane I sounded. Walsh was checking my air gauge, frowning at the reading. "You burned through your air fast. Panic breathing, probably. Classic sign of nitrogen narcosis or equipment anxiety." "I stabbed him," I said quietly. "I stabbed Steve 3 times with my diving knife and the wounds just closed up. He wouldn't die." The silence stretched between us. Rodriguez stood up slowly, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his belt. Walsh continued working on my gear, but I could see the concern in his green eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses. "Okay," Rodriguez said carefully. "Let's get you warmed up and hydrated. Walsh, fire up the compressor and get a fresh tank ready. We're going back down to find Morrison." "No," I said, grabbing Rodriguez's arm. "You can't go down there. Whatever's in that wreck, it got Steve. It'll get you too." Rodriguez gently pulled free from my grip. "Chen, I've got a missing diver and a partner who's clearly suffering from some kind of diving-related stress. Standard protocol is immediate search and recovery." Walsh had moved to a bank of equipment near the wheelhouse, pulling cables and checking connections. "Captain, I've got the dive camera footage queued up. Might help us understand what happened down there." My stomach dropped. The camera. I'd completely forgotten about the helmet-mounted camera that recorded everything during our dive. If what I'd seen was real, it would all be there on the footage. Good thinking, Rodriguez said. Chen, come take a look. Help us understand what we're dealing with. I stood on shaky legs, still dripping seawater onto the deck. Walsh had connected my camera to a laptop computer, the screen showing a blue desktop with video playback software loading. My hands were still trembling as I walked over to where they'd set up the equipment. Footage starts when you hit the water, Walsh said, clicking play. Should show us everything from descent to ascent. The screen filled with underwater imagery, the familiar blue-green of deep water, then the massive bulk of the Meridian star coming into view. I watched myself and Steve approach the hull breach, saw us swim through the twisted metal opening into the ship's interior. There, I said, pointing at the screen. That's where we split up. I went to the crew quarters first. But as the footage continued, my blood turned cold. The camera showed me swimming alone through empty corridors. No Steve, no bodies floating in the crew quarters. Just me, moving through vacant rooms and talking to empty water. "Where's Morrison?" Rodriguez asked, leaning closer to the screen. I watched myself enter the crew quarters, saw my own hands reaching out to grab nothing, gesturing frantically at empty space where the dead man in coveralls should have been floating. On the footage, I looked like I was having a conversation with the water itself. "He was right there," I whispered. "Steve was right there with me." Walsh fast-forwarded through the footage, stopping at the galley scene. Again, the camera showed me alone, pointing at empty cabinets and trying to grab something that wasn't there. No Steve methodically searching through storage lockers. No bodies floating in the mess hall. "Jesus," Rodriguez muttered. "Chen, you're alone in every frame." The footage continued to the engine room, where I watched myself draw my diving knife and stab repeatedly at empty water. The camera captured me fighting with nothing, slashing at shadows while the green glow from the control panel pulsed in the background. I saw myself drop knife after knife, watched them tumble to the engine room floor. "The control panel," I said desperately. "You can see the green light. That's not normal ship equipment." Walsh paused the video and zoomed in on the panel. On screen, it looked like standard maritime electronics, gauges, switches, and dark monitors. No alien symbols, no pulsing green glow. Just ordinary ship controls covered in 6 months of marine growth. "Looks like normal engine room equipment to me," Walsh said quietly. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Everything I'd experienced, everything I'd seen, none of it was there. The footage showed a solo dive through an empty wreck, with me apparently suffering some kind of breakdown and fighting with hallucinations. "The beacon," I said weakly. The emergency beacon was coming from that panel. Rodriguez checked his equipment readings. "Beacon signals still transmitting. Standard maritime frequency. Nothing unusual about it." I watched the rest of the footage in stunned silence. The camera showed me swimming alone through corridors, past empty doorways where I'd seen the 12 corpses following us. It showed me fleeing from nothing, racing through vacant passages toward the hull breach. When the footage ended, the 3 of us stood in silence on the deck. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, but I felt cold all the way through. "Equipment malfunction?" Walsh suggested. "Maybe his regulator was feeding him bad air, caused hallucinations." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Or nitrogen narcosis combined with the stress of a deep wreck dive. Happens more often than people think." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd experienced was real, but the evidence was right there on the screen. 43 minutes of footage showing me alone in an empty wreck, talking to myself and fighting with shadows. "We still need to find Morrison," Rodriguez said. "Walsh, get that fresh tank ready. I'm going down with a full search team." "Captain, wait," I said, though I wasn't sure why. If the footage was accurate, If I'd been hallucinating everything, then Steve was probably just lost somewhere in the wreck. Maybe trapped, maybe injured, but not transformed into some kind of undead puppet. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something deep in my gut insisted that what I'd seen was real. The feel of Steve's impossible strength, the cold touch of the corpses, the alien symbols on those monitors. It had all felt too vivid, too detailed to be a hallucination. Rodriguez was already suiting up, checking his regulator and adjusting his mask. Walsh handed him a fresh tank and helped him into his buoyancy vest. "I'm coming with you," I said. "Like hell you are," Rodriguez replied. "You're staying topside until we figure out what happened down there. Walsh, monitor the radio and keep an eye on Chen." I watched Rodriguez gear up, my hands clenched into fists. Every instinct told me not to let him go down there alone. But what could I say? That I'd seen things that didn't show up on camera? That my diving partner had been possessed by some kind of alien intelligence? Rodriguez performed his final equipment check, then walked to the dive ladder. "If Morrison's trapped somewhere in that wreck, we'll find him. Probably just got disoriented in the corridors." He disappeared over the side with a splash. Walsh and I stood at the rail, watching his bubbles trail away toward the wreck site. The afternoon was perfectly calm, with barely a ripple on the surface. "You really think you saw all that?" Walsh asked quietly. I stared down at the water, watching Rodriguez's air bubbles grow smaller as he descended. "I don't know anymore. The footage doesn't lie." But even as I said it, I found myself scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of the research boat that had brought us out here. Because if what I'd experienced was real, if that thing in the wreck could somehow affect recording equipment or alter what cameras captured, then Rodriguez was swimming straight into a trap. And there was nothing I could do to stop him. I stood at the boat's railing, watching the last of Captain Rodriguez's air bubbles disappear toward the wreck below. My hands gripped the metal so tight my knuckles had gone white. Walsh stood beside me, clipboard in hand, tracking Rodriguez's descent time. "He's been down 3 minutes," Walsh said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Should reach the wreck in another 2. I wanted to grab the radio and call Rodriguez back up. Tell him not to go near that engine room, not to touch those glowing panels. But what could I say? That I'd seen dead bodies that didn't show up on camera? That my diving partner had turned into something else entirely? "The footage doesn't lie," Walsh continued, tapping his pen against the clipboard. 43 minutes of you diving alone. No Morrison, no bodies, no supernatural light show. I'd watched that footage 3 times now, seen myself swimming through empty corridors, gesturing at nothing, having conversations with seawater. In the engine room, the camera showed me stabbing at empty space with my diving knife, while standard maritime electronics hummed quietly in the background. No green glow, no alien symbols. Just me, alone, apparently losing my mind. "Equipment malfunction," I said, more to myself than Walsh. "Has to be. Or nitrogen narcosis," Walsh replied. "Happens to experienced divers too. Depth does funny things to the brain." But I remembered every detail. The cold touch of that first corpse's fingers through my wetsuit. The way Steve's wounds had sealed themselves. The synchronized movements of 13 transformed beings following me through those corridors. It had been real. I knew it had been real. "Captain Rodriguez is at the wreck," Walsh announced, checking his watch, beginning his search pattern. I closed my eyes and tried to think. If the camera hadn't recorded what I'd experienced, then something down there was affecting the equipment, or affecting perception itself. Maybe the wreck was some kind of trap that made people see what it wanted them to see. Made them experience what it needed them to experience. "I need to look at that footage again," I said. Walsh glanced up from his clipboard. "You've already watched it 3 times. Something's wrong with it. Has to be. Chen, you need to accept what happened. Diving accidents mess with your head. It's not your fault." I pushed away from the railing and headed toward the boat's control room. The small space contained 3 computer workstations, navigation equipment, and communication gear. Walsh's laptop sat open on the center desk. The dive footage paused on a frame showing me swimming alone through the ship's main corridor. I sat down at the workstation and clicked play. Watched myself enter the crew quarters, point at empty bunks, gesture frantically at nothing. The timestamp showed I'd spent 4 minutes in that room, apparently talking to myself. But I remembered finding that first body, remembered its eyes tracking my movement, remembered the impossible preservation of flesh that should have been rotted after 6 months underwater. The footage continued. Me in the galley, examining empty cabinets. Me in the mess hall, swimming around tables and chairs with no bodies in sight. Me in the engine room, stabbing at water while perfectly normal control panels blinked with standard indicator lights. I paused the video and leaned back in the chair. Either I'd suffered the most detailed hallucination in diving history, or something down there was powerful enough to manipulate recording equipment. Neither option made me feel better about Rodriguez's current situation. The radio crackled. "Surface team, this is Rodriguez. I'm at the wreck site, beginning interior search." Walsh grabbed the microphone. "Copy that, Captain. We're monitoring from topside." I wanted to key the radio myself, warn Rodriguez about the engine room, tell him to stay away from any glowing panels. But what could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of someone who'd cracked under pressure? "Rodriguez, be advised," Walsh continued. "Chen reported unusual preservation conditions inside the wreck, possible structural hazards." "Understood. I'm seeing what Chen described. Ship's in remarkable condition for 6 months underwater." My blood went cold. Rodriguez was confirming what I'd observed about the wreck's impossible preservation. That part, at least, was real. Entering the main corridor now, Rodriguez's voice continued through the radio. "No sign of Morrison yet." I stood up and paced to the small window overlooking the dive site. The water was calm, afternoon sunlight creating patterns on the surface. Somewhere below, Rodriguez was swimming through those same corridors where I'd encountered 13 transformed beings, where Steve had tried to drag me toward that alien control panel. "Captain, what's your air supply?" Walsh asked. "Plenty of air. I'm moving toward the engine room." Chen's beacon detector was picking up signals from that direction. I grabbed the microphone from Walsh's hand. "Rodriguez, stay away from the engine room. Don't touch any control panels." Static filled the radio for several seconds before Rodriguez responded. "Chen, you're not authorized on this channel. Walsh, maintain communication protocol." Walsh took the microphone back and gave me a warning look. "Sorry, Captain. Chen's still processing his experience." "Understood. I'm approaching the engine room now. Doors already open." I felt sick. Rodriguez was walking into the same trap that had taken Steve, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, because nobody believed what I'd seen down there. "Remarkable." Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. "This equipment looks brand new. No corrosion at all." "Captain, can you see any sign of Morrison?" Walsh asked. "Negative, but I'm seeing some unusual electronics here. Control panels that don't match standard maritime equipment." My heart started pounding. Rodriguez was describing the same alien technology I'd witnessed, the same panels that had transformed Steve into something else entirely. "Rodriguez, get out of there," I said, loud enough for the radio to pick up my voice. "Don't touch anything." "Chen, step away from the radio," Walsh ordered, but I could hear something changing in Rodriguez's voice, a subtle shift in tone, like he was speaking from farther away. "These displays are interesting. Symbols I don't recognize." "Captain, please confirm your status," Walsh said into the microphone. Silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then Rodriguez's voice returned, but it sounded different. Flatter, more mechanical. "Status is good. Continuing search for Morrison." Walsh seemed satisfied, but I knew that tone. I'd heard it in Steve's voice right before he'd tried to drag me to those glowing panels. Rodriguez was already changing. I needed to see that footage again. Needed to understand what the camera had actually recorded versus what I'd experienced. I sat back down at the workstation and rewound the video to the engine room sequence. On screen, I watched myself swim toward a wall of standard maritime electronics. No green glow, no alien symbols, just normal control panels with familiar gauges and switches. I watched myself press my hands against the displays, but they showed only routine system readouts. Then I noticed something. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a shadow that didn't match the lighting. A dark shape that moved independently of my position. I paused the video and enhanced that section of the image. The shadow was human-shaped, and it was reaching toward me. I rewound and played the sequence again, focusing on that corner. The shadow appeared in 3 separate frames, always reaching, always moving closer to my position. But the main camera view showed only empty water around me. My hands started shaking. The camera had recorded something. Not what I'd seen, but something. Proof that I hadn't been alone down there. I needed to check the other sequences. I fast-forwarded to the crew quarters and examined every frame carefully. There, in the reflection on a metal surface, barely visible, the outline of a figure floating near the bunks. And in the galley sequence, a distortion in the water that moved like someone swimming just outside the camera's field of view. The evidence was there, hidden in shadows and reflections and distortions that could easily be dismissed as equipment artifacts. But I knew what I was looking at. The camera had recorded the presence of something, even if it couldn't capture the full reality of what was happening. I saved the enhanced images to a separate file and stood up. I needed to show Walsh these anomalies, convince him that something was genuinely wrong with this dive site. But before I could call him over, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw someone sitting at the workstation across the room. A figure in full diving gear, wetsuit still dripping, mask pushed up on his forehead, dark hair plastered to his skull, regulator hanging loose around his neck. Steve Morrison looked exactly as he had when we'd first descended to the wreck, except his skin had a pale, waxy quality, and his eyes held that same vacant awareness I'd seen in all the corpses. He was completely dry despite appearing to have just surfaced from a dive. Steve turned in his chair and smiled at me with perfect white teeth. I stared at Steve Morrison sitting at the computer terminal, his pale, waxy skin gleaming under the control room's fluorescent lights. Water still dripped from his wetsuit onto the floor, forming a small puddle around the chair legs. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, and when he turned to look at me, those vacant, aware eyes held the same terrible recognition I'd seen in all the corpses down in the wreck. "You can't leave the ship, Marcus," Steve said, his voice carrying that same flat mechanical tone I'd heard from Captain Rodriguez over the radio. "Everyone's waiting for you down in the wreck. Forever." The words hit me like ice water. I took a step backward toward the control room door, my wet boots squeaking against the metal floor. Steve's smile widened, showing those perfect white teeth that seemed too bright in his waxy face. "We've been waiting so long," he continued, standing up from the chair with movements that were too smooth, too precise. "The beacon worked perfectly. You came, just like we knew you would. I backed up another step, but Steve moved to block my path to the door. He didn't walk exactly. It was more like he glided across the floor, his feet barely making contact with the metal decking. The diving regulator still hung around his neck, swaying slightly with each movement. "Steve, listen to me," I said, though I knew it was pointless. Whatever was speaking through his mouth wasn't Steve Morrison anymore. "You're not yourself. Something happened down there in the engine room." "I'm exactly myself," Steve replied, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "Just improved, enhanced, like you're going to be." He reached toward me with both hands, fingers spread wide. I could see the holes in his wetsuit where I'd stabbed him with the diving knives, but the neoprene had sealed itself perfectly. No tears, no damage, like the attacks had never happened. I grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall next to the door. The red metal cylinder was heavier than I expected, and my hands were still shaking from everything that had happened. Steve's eyes tracked the movement, but his expression didn't change. "That won't help," he said. "Nothing can help now." I pulled the safety pin and aimed the nozzle at his face. "Stay back." Steve took another step forward, arms still outstretched. I squeezed the handle, and white foam erupted from the extinguisher, hitting him square in the chest and face. The chemical cloud filled the small control room, and I heard Steve make a sound, not quite human, more like air escaping from a punctured tire. I ran past him toward the door, shouldering through the foam cloud. My boots slipped on the wet floor, but I managed to keep my balance and burst through the doorway onto the boat's deck. "We need to leave," I shouted to the crew. "Everyone off the boat now. Emergency evacuation." The words died in my throat as I saw them. Captain Rodriguez stood near the port railing, perfectly motionless. Technician Walsh was positioned by the diving equipment, his clipboard still in his hands. Two other crew members I'd barely noticed before were spaced evenly across the deck. All of them were staring directly at me with the same blank expression Steve had worn underwater. Their eyes were wide and unblinking. Rodriguez's weathered face had taken on that same waxy pallor, and Walsh's wire-rimmed glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight like mirrors. None of them moved. They just stood there, watching me with those terrible aware eyes that saw everything and felt nothing. "Captain?" I called out, though I already knew it was useless. "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" Rodriguez's mouth opened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice had the same mechanical flatness as Steve's. "Welcome back, Marcus. We've been waiting." Walsh nodded slowly, his head moving like it was on a pivot. "The beacon worked perfectly." The other crew members didn't speak, but they all smiled in perfect unison. The same white teeth, the same empty expression. They began moving toward me with that same gliding motion Steve had used, their feet barely touching the deck. I ran toward the boat's radio equipment mounted near the wheelhouse. My hands fumbled with the controls, trying to remember the emergency frequency. The radio crackled to life, and I grabbed the microphone. "Mayday, Mayday, this is research vessel." I realized I didn't even know the boat's name. "This is a diving vessel 15 miles off the coast. We have a crew emergency. Multiple casualties. Request immediate assistance." Static filled the speaker. Then a voice responded. "Research vessel. This is Coast Guard station. Please identify your vessel and state the nature of your emergency." "The crew has been compromised," I said, watching the 5 figures continue their slow approach across the deck. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they were all controlled by the same signal. "Something from the wreck site. They're not human anymore." "Research vessel, please clarify. Are you reporting medical emergencies or equipment failure?" I looked back at the approaching crew. They were only 20 feet away now, still smiling, still moving with that unnatural precision. Rodriguez raised one hand and beckoned to me. "Both," I said into the microphone. "Neither. I don't know how to explain it." I dropped the radio and ran toward the stern where the emergency equipment was stored. The life raft was mounted in a white fiberglass container next to the dive ladder. I found the manual release cord and yanked it hard. The container split open and the raft began inflating with a loud hissing sound. The crew members were 15 feet away now. I could hear their breathing, or what sounded like breathing. It was too regular, too synchronized, like they were all sharing the same lungs. The life raft finished inflating and bobbed in the water next to the boat. I grabbed the emergency supply kit from its mounting bracket and threw it into the raft, then swung my legs over the railing. "Marcus!" Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying across the deck. "You can't leave. The beacon is still calling." I looked back one last time. All 5 crew members had stopped at the railing, watching me with those terrible smiling faces. Steve Morrison emerged from the control room, white foam still clinging to his wetsuit, and joined the others. 6 figures now, all perfectly still, all staring down at me with eyes that reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. I jumped into the life raft and immediately started the small outboard motor. The engine coughed to life on the second pull, and I steered away from the research vessel as fast as the little motor would carry me. Behind me, the 6 figures remained at the railing, motionless as statues. They didn't call out or try to stop me. They just watched as the distance between us grew, their smiles never wavering, their eyes never blinking. The research boat began to drift with the current, its engines silent. I could see the crew still standing at the railing, getting smaller as I moved away, but they never moved from their positions. They just stood there like sentinels, waiting for something I couldn't understand. I floated in the orange life raft, watching the research vessel grow smaller against the gray horizon. The 6 figures remained at the railing like mannequins in a store window. Rodriguez, Walsh, Steve, and the 3 other crew members whose names I'd never learned. They hadn't moved since I'd jumped overboard, not even to wave goodbye. The emergency supply kit sat beside me in the raft's bottom, a waterproof case about the size of a tackle box. I popped it open and found what I'd hoped for: a handheld marine radio along with flares, water purification tablets, and emergency rations. The radio was one of those yellow waterproof models with a stubby antenna. I extended it fully and switched to channel 16. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Marcus Chen in a life raft approximately 15 miles southeast of Harbor Point. I have multiple casualties and need immediate assistance." Static crackled back at me. I tried again, giving my approximate coordinates based on where we'd been diving. The research boat was now just a white speck on the water, drifting with the current. Those things standing on deck were probably still watching me. "Mayday, mayday. Life raft with single survivor. Research vessel crew compromised. Need immediate pickup." More static. I checked the radio's battery indicator. Full charge. The antenna was extended properly. I was broadcasting on the right frequency. But 15 miles offshore was a long way for a handheld radio to reach. I kept trying every few minutes, varying my message. "Coast Guard, Coast Guard. This is emergency traffic. Single survivor in life raft. Crew missing. Need assistance." The sun climbed higher, and I started to feel the first hints of thirst. The emergency water in the kit would last maybe 2 days if I rationed it carefully. After what felt like hours, a voice crackled through the static. "Life raft calling Mayday. This is Coast Guard Station Harbor Point. We copy your transmission. What is your current position?" Relief flooded through me. "Coast Guard, thank God. I'm in an orange life raft about 15 miles southeast of Harbor Point. The research vessel Maritime Research was investigating a wreck site. The crew. Something happened to the crew." Copy that. Can you be more specific about your location? Do you have GPS coordinates? I looked around the empty ocean. Negative on GPS. We were diving the Meridian Star wreck site. The research boat should be visible from aircraft. White hull, about 60 feet long. Roger. We're launching a helicopter for search and rescue. Can you describe the nature of the emergency with your crew? How could I explain what I'd seen? The crew became incapacitated. I had to abandon ship. They're still aboard the research vessel, but they need medical attention. Copy. Are you injured? Minor decompression issues. I ascended too fast during the dive. Understood. Helicopter is airborne. Estimated time to your area is 45 minutes. Continue monitoring this frequency. I kept the radio close and scanned the sky. The research boat had disappeared completely now, either drifted beyond the horizon or... I didn't want to think about the other possibilities. Maybe it had sunk. Maybe those things had taken it back down to the wreck where they belonged. The sun was directly overhead when I heard the helicopter. A orange and white Coast Guard Jayhawk appeared from the northeast, flying low over the water in a search pattern. I grabbed one of the flares from the emergency kit, pulled the cap, and struck it against the rough surface. Red smoke billowed up from the raft. The helicopter banked toward me immediately. Within minutes, it was hovering overhead, the rotor wash whipping spray across the raft. A rescue swimmer dropped into the water beside me, a young guy in a red dry suit with Martinez stenciled on his chest. "You Marcus Chen?" he shouted over the helicopter noise. "That's me. Any injuries?" "Possible decompression sickness. Mild symptoms." He helped me into a rescue basket, and we were both winched up to the helicopter. Inside, a flight medic started checking my vital signs while Martinez talked to the pilot about searching for the research vessel. "Where did you last see your boat?" the pilot asked me through the headset. I pointed southeast. "Maybe 5 miles that direction. White hull, 60-foot converted fishing boat. 6 people aboard." We flew search patterns for over an hour. The ocean stretched empty in all directions. No sign of the maritime research vessel, no debris, no oil slick. Nothing. It was like the boat had never existed. "Could they have made it back to port?" the pilot asked. I shook my head. The crew was incapacitated. They couldn't operate the vessel. The flight medic was taking my blood pressure. What happened to them exactly? "I'm not sure. Some kind of medical emergency. They became unresponsive. We flew expanding search patterns until fuel ran low, then headed back to the Coast Guard station. I stared out the window at the empty water, knowing we wouldn't find anything. Those things weren't coming back to the surface. They had what they wanted now: 6 more bodies to add to their collection. At the station, they transferred me to an ambulance. The EMTs were professional, but I could see the questions in their eyes. Single survivor, missing boat, crew of 6 vanished without a trace. It didn't add up to anything that made sense. Harbor General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and floor wax. They put me in the emergency department and ran tests: blood work, chest x-rays, neurological exams. Dr. Sarah Kim was the attending physician, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes. "Your blood work shows some nitrogen saturation consistent with rapid ascent," she said, reviewing my chart. "But nothing dangerous. You're lucky you didn't get bent worse than this. I had to surface fast. Emergency situation." "Tell me about this emergency." I'd been thinking about this during the helicopter ride. How much could I say without sounding completely insane? The crew became ill, some kind of group medical event. I couldn't help them and had to abandon ship. Group medical event? Like food poisoning? Something like that. They became unresponsive. Couldn't communicate properly. Dr. Kim made notes. And you were diving when this happened? I surfaced and found them in this condition. I tried to help, but I shrugged. I had to get out of there. She ordered me admitted for overnight observation due to the decompression issues. They gave me a room on the 3rd floor with a view of the harbor. I could see Coast Guard vessels coming and going, probably still searching for the maritime research boat. A Coast Guard investigator visited that evening. Lieutenant Commander Janet Torres, a serious woman with short brown hair and a clipboard full of forms. She sat in the visitor's chair and opened her notebook. Mr. Chen, I need to get a complete statement about what happened today. I told her the same story I told the doctor. Research dive on the Meridian Star wreck. Crew became ill while I was underwater. Had to abandon ship when I surfaced and found them unresponsive. What was the nature of this illness? I'm not a doctor. They seemed confused, disoriented, couldn't respond to questions normally. All 6 crew members simultaneously. That's right. She made notes. And you felt the situation was dangerous enough to abandon ship rather than try to help them. I tried to help, but they wouldn't respond to me, and I was concerned about my own safety. Were they violent? Threatening? I hesitated. How could I explain that they'd been smiling at me with dead eyes, moving in perfect synchronization like puppets? Not violent exactly, but their behavior was wrong, unnatural. Unnatural how? They moved strangely, spoke in monotone voices. It was like they weren't themselves anymore. Torres wrote this down. Had you noticed any signs of illness among the crew before the dive? No. Everyone seemed normal during the transit to the dive site. And you're certain all 6 were aboard when you abandoned ship? Positive. They were all standing at the railing when I left in the life raft. But they made no attempt to stop you or call for help? No. They just watched. She closed her notebook. Mr. Chen, I have to tell you, this story raises some questions. 6 experienced maritime professionals don't just become simultaneously incapacitated without cause. And if they were as ill as you describe, how were they able to stand at the railing? I don't know. I'm just telling you what I saw. We'll continue searching, but after 12 hours with no sign of the vessel, she stood up. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Anything you might have left out? I thought about the bodies in the wreck, Steve's transformation, the alien control panels. No, that's everything. After she left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The official story was already taking shape. Research vessel lost at sea, crew missing and presumed drowned, sole survivor rescued from life raft. They'd search for a few more days, find nothing, and close the case. Steve Morrison and the others would be listed as missing, presumed dead. But I knew they weren't dead. They were something else now. Standing in that engine room with the green glow, waiting for the next diving team to answer the beacon's call. The emergency signal was still transmitting from the wreck, still broadcasting its invitation to anyone who might be listening. A nurse came in to check my IV around midnight. How are you feeling, Mr. Chen? Better. When can I go home? Doctor wants to keep you until morning. Make sure there are no delayed symptoms from the decompression. She left, and I was alone with my thoughts again. Through the window, I could see the harbor lights reflecting on the water. Somewhere out there, 15 miles southeast, the Meridian Star sat on the ocean floor with its impossible crew of preserved corpses and its alien machinery pulsing with green light. The beacon was still calling. I sat in my apartment kitchen the next morning, staring at the same pile of unpaid bills that had been there when Captain Rodriguez first called. The coffee had gone cold in my mug, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it anyway. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Steve's face in that control room. The waxy skin, the vacant stare, that mechanical smile. The hospital had released me at 8 in the morning with instructions to take it easy for a few days. Dr. Kim had been concerned about delayed decompression symptoms, but my body felt fine. It was my mind that wouldn't stop racing. I pulled out my laptop and opened a browser. If I was going crazy, at least I could document it properly. I started with the basics. Meridian Star Cargo Manifest. The search results were sparse. A few shipping industry databases, some insurance filings. I clicked through page after page of bureaucratic language until I found what I was looking for. The manifest listed standard freight cargo, automotive parts, electronics, textiles. Nothing unusual until I reached the bottom of the list. There, in small print, was an entry that made my stomach drop. Archaeological specimen, University of Washington Maritime Studies, permit AS4792. I clicked on the permit number, but it led to a dead page. The University of Washington Maritime Studies Department didn't seem to exist anymore. I tried different search terms: UW Maritime Archaeology, Archaeological Specimen Shipping, permit AS4792. Nothing. But when I searched for archaeological specimen and cargo ship, I found something that made my hand shake. The first article was from a maritime safety blog, dated 3 years ago. Diving team missing near wreck of research vessel Poseidon's Dream. The Poseidon's Dream had sunk off the coast of Oregon, carrying what the article described as sensitive archaeological materials. A commercial diving team had been hired to recover the cargo. All 4 divers had vanished. The Coast Guard found their boat drifting empty, engines still running. I kept searching. The pattern emerged like a nightmare taking shape. 2 years ago, the cargo vessel Northern Light went down in a storm near Alaska. It had been transporting cultural artifacts from a dig site in the Aleutian Islands. When salvage divers were sent to investigate, their support vessel was found abandoned. No bodies were ever recovered. 18 months ago, the freighter Atlantic Dawn sank off Nova Scotia. The manifest showed it was carrying archaeological specimens bound for a private collector in Europe. 3 separate diving teams had attempted recovery operations. All 3 teams disappeared without a trace. I found 7 more incidents spanning the last 5 years. Different locations, different ships, but always the same elements. Cargo vessels carrying archaeological specimens, emergency beacons that activated months after sinking, diving teams that vanished completely. The most recent case before the Meridian Star was the research ship Calypso's Wake, which had gone down 8 months ago near the Bahamas. It had been carrying what the insurance documents described as pre-Columbian artifacts of unknown origin. The emergency beacon had started transmitting after 6 months of silence. A commercial salvage company had sent a team to investigate. The diver's boat was found 3 days later, drifting in perfect condition with the engines off and no crew aboard. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. The emergency beacon hadn't been a malfunction or a coincidence. It was bait. Something down in those wrecks was calling to the surface, luring divers down to join whatever collection of preserved corpses was waiting in the dark. I grabbed my phone and dialed the Coast Guard station. Lieutenant Commander Torres answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Marcus Chen," I said. "The survivor from the maritime research incident yesterday. I need to speak with you about the Meridian Star wreck." "Mr. Chen, we've suspended the search for your vessel. After 12 hours with no contact or debris field, we're treating this as a missing vessel case. I'm sorry, but..." You need to stop any other diving operations near that wreck, I interrupted. The emergency beacon is still transmitting, right? Other salvage companies are going to respond to it. There was a pause. Mr. Chen, are you feeling all right? The doctor said you might experience some disorientation after your ordeal. I'm not disoriented. I've been researching similar incidents. Ships carrying archaeological specimens, emergency beacons that activate months after sinking, diving teams that disappear. This has happened at least 8 times in the last 5 years. Mr. Chen, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but check the cargo manifest for the Meridian Star. Look up permit AS4792, then cross-reference it with the other incidents I'm telling you about. The Poseidon's Dream, the Northern Light, the Atlantic Dawn. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down. If you're experiencing anxiety or paranoid thoughts, I can recommend some resources. I hung up. She thought I was having a breakdown. Without proof, without the footage that somehow showed me diving alone, my story sounded like the ravings of someone with severe decompression sickness. I tried the Maritime Safety Administration next. The clerk who answered transferred me to 3 different departments before I finally reached someone who claimed to handle unusual incident reports. I explained about the pattern of missing diving teams and archaeological cargo, but the response was the same. Concern for my mental state, suggestions that I seek counseling, polite dismissal. By noon, I had called 6 different agencies: the Coast Guard, the Maritime Safety Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, even the FBI's Maritime Crime Division. Every conversation ended the same way. Without physical evidence, without corroborating witnesses, I was just another traumatized survivor seeing patterns that weren't there. I sat back down at my laptop and continued researching. If the authorities wouldn't listen, maybe I could find someone who would. I searched for maritime archaeology forums, diving safety websites, anywhere that people might be discussing these incidents. On a deep-sea diving forum, I found a thread titled, "Weird Salvage Jobs. Anyone else notice this?" The original post was from a commercial diver named Rick Hendricks, dated 6 months ago. Been diving commercially for 15 years. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of jobs for archaeological recovery from cargo ships that went down carrying museum pieces or university specimens. The weird part is, these beacons always start transmitting months after the ships sink, not right away. And I've heard from other divers that teams keep going missing on these jobs. Anyone else notice this pattern? The thread had 43 replies. Most were dismissive, but a few caught my attention. My buddy Jake was supposed to dive the Poseidon's Dream wreck 2 years ago. His whole team vanished. Coast Guard found their boat, but no bodies. Jake's wife still gets calls from salvage companies asking if he's available for work. I turned down a job on the Atlantic Dawn last year. Something felt off about it. The company offering the contract couldn't tell me what exactly they were looking for, just archaeological specimens. Found out later the whole dive team disappeared. There's a list going around of cursed wrecks that commercial divers won't touch anymore. All of them are cargo ships that were carrying museum pieces or artifacts when they went down. I scrolled through more replies, finding fragments of the same story I was piecing together. Divers who had heard rumors, salvage companies that had lost entire teams, families still waiting for missing crew members to come home. At the bottom of the thread, posted just 2 weeks ago, was a message that made my blood run cold. Emergency beacon just activated from the Meridian Star wreck off Harbor Point. Cargo manifest shows archaeological specimens. Maritime Research Division is putting together a dive team. Anyone interested in the job? The reply was from a user named Salvage Pro Mike. I'll take it. Need the money. When do we start? I checked the timestamp. The message had been posted 12 days ago, 2 days before Captain Rodriguez had called me. I grabbed my phone and dialed the Maritime Research Division. The receptionist who answered confirmed that they had indeed contracted with a diver named Mike Sullivan for the Meridian Star recovery operation, but that the mission had been completed and Mr. Sullivan was no longer needed. Completed? I asked. What do you mean, completed? The diving team successfully investigated the wreck site and filed their report. The emergency beacon has been deactivated. What about the crew? Are they all right? I'm sorry, sir, but I can't discuss personnel matters with unauthorized individuals. I hung up and immediately searched for Mike Sullivan, commercial diver. I found his business website, his LinkedIn profile, even his Facebook page. According to his social media, he had been excited about a big salvage job 2 weeks ago. His last post was from 11 days ago, heading out for a deep water recovery. Wish me luck. There had been no posts since then. I called his business number. It went straight to voicemail. You've reached Sullivan Marine Salvage. I'm currently on assignment and will return calls when I'm back on shore. The message had been recorded 11 days ago. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling every maritime contractor and salvage company I could find online. The story was always the same. Teams had been hired for archaeological recovery operations. They had gone to investigate wrecks carrying museum specimens or university artifacts, and they had never returned. The companies that hired them claimed the jobs had been completed successfully, but the divers themselves had vanished. By evening, I had documented 12 separate incidents over the past 5 years, 37 missing divers in total. All of them had been investigating cargo ships that had been carrying archaeological specimens when they sank. All of the ships had emergency beacons that activated months after going down. I printed out everything I had found and put it in a manila folder. Tomorrow I would try again with the authorities. Maybe if I presented the information systematically, showed them the pattern, someone would listen. But as I sat in my kitchen that night, looking out at the harbor lights reflecting on the dark water, I knew the truth. The thing in the Meridian Star was still down there, waiting. The beacon was still calling. And somewhere out there, another diving team was probably suiting up right now, ready to answer that call. I had survived, but I was the only one who knew what was really happening. And no one would believe me until it was too late. The emergency beacon would keep transmitting. The archaeological specimens would keep calling to the surface. And divers would keep disappearing, one team at a time, until someone figured out how to stop it. I closed the folder and turned off the lights. Outside, the harbor was quiet, except for the gentle lapping of waves against the docks. 15 miles southeast, the Meridian Star sat on the ocean floor with its cargo of impossible things, its engine room glowing green in the darkness, its crew of preserved corpses standing watch and waiting for the next visitors to join their eternal collection.